Okay, I am seeing thumbs up. All right. So first of all, thank you, Helen, for opening the Zoom link, and thank you for monitoring the participants and the Zoom participants. We'll just go ahead and get started, I guess, since it's now 4:03. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Micah Hirsch. I am currently a postdoctoral research associate at the STEP Lab at Boston University. And I'm really excited to be presenting with Dr. James Borders today. I'll give him a chance to introduce himself in just a sec, but we're going to be talking about open data and sharing open data and hopefully giving you a good guide for how you can incorporate this practice in your own research. So that's enough about our introduction and me. I'm going to just give James a minute to introduce himself before we get started.
Oh yeah, sure. Hey everyone, I'm James Borders. I'm currently a postdoc over at Columbia University and an incoming assistant professor at Boston University. So excited to be here. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So let's dive right into it. So I'm imagining that most of you here, if you've been following CSDisseminate and or OpenCSD for a while, you've heard of the term open science and are probably somewhat familiar with the concept of open science. But just as a brief background for anyone who may not be as familiar is when we say open science, this refers to a collection of practices that have the intention of making our research more open and transparent and accessible to not only other researchers, but also to the general public. So there are a number of different practices that can fall under this, as you can see in this little graphic here, such as open access, open source, etc. And what we'd be talking about today, open data. To go in a little bit more in depth of what open science is, again, these practices aim to increase the transparency, accessibility, and reproducibility of science. And there's a couple of different practices that can fall under that. So in the past, CSDisseminate has spent a lot of time talking about things like gold open access or self-archiving. So gold open access refers to making your papers open access, usually by paying a fee to a publisher to allow it to be published as an open access article. Self-archiving is a related practice, but instead of paying a publisher fee to make your article open access, this is you posting usually a preprint or postprint version of your manuscript on some type of online space, like your own personal website or a platform like Open Science Framework. And then, of course, there's open data materials, which is just the practice of sharing data and any related study materials. And then pre-registration, which is the process of registering your hypotheses and your study protocol and design prior to data collection and or analysis. So this is not an exhaustive list of the different practices that can fall under open science. And we would be here for a really long time if we were to get into every one of these. So for today, we are going to focus our attention on open data and materials. So how does the use of open science look in the field of CSDisseminate? Well, actually, a few colleagues from CSDisseminate have recently, within the past couple of years, published a paper on this, where they surveyed researchers in the communication science and disorders field about their knowledge and participation in select open science practices, including the 4 that I just went over here. And when we look at all of them, but especially open data, we see that the participants in the study largely reported some knowledge of what open data, like data sharing, is. However, they also reported low participation, not really engaging in this practice a lot. So the purpose of our presentation today is to hopefully give you all the tools and resources to be able to start engaging in this open science practice. So we'll get into it about open data and materials. So to start, there's an ethical need for having open data or open materials because as researchers, we do have a responsibility to maximize our data use. Open data extends its impact beyond publication. So when you publish on your data, you're usually only publishing on the research questions that you probably came into the study with or the project with. When you share your data, you're allowing the possibility to extend your data's life, so to speak, and to help generate new research questions. When you have closed data, so basically not making your data free or accessible to participants, this places a burden on your readers, your researchers who want to access the data for any potential study ideas, as well as future participants in research about questions that might be able to be solved with existing data. And then also important to note, researchers who are conducting publicly funded studies are ethically obligated to report um, the data and return the data to the public that finance their research. So sharing your data, especially if you are funded by some organization like the NIH or NSF, you're basically making your research process more transparent and accessible to the taxpayers who helped fund your research. So some additional benefits of sharing data. Sharing your data increases the transparency of your research as well as the reproducibility. So when you share your data, you're allowing others the opportunity to be able to possibly replicate your findings or to also just see what your research workflow was. It also can help increase research equity. We do know that not every researcher has the same access to different resources, whether it be by your institutional resource that you have available to funding resources. So when you share your research, it kind of goes along with that, giving your data extra life where you're allowing others to be able to use your research to further the field and then give them opportunities to publish as well. Which all kind of goes into the last point, which is increasing the impact of the research that you're doing. So when I'm talking about open data and open materials, I tend to talk about, even though these are technically two different practices as defined by like the open science umbrella, I tend to talk about them together. So I thought I'd just clarify what I mean by each term first. So open data usually refers to basically the data that you're collecting from your participants. So this might be participant demographic information, any test scores that they may have, any other behavioral or physiological measures collected from them, audio or video data, etc. Meanwhile, open materials refers to basically the things that you needed to use in order to do your study. So any software packages that you use for data collection, any analysis codes and scripts that you used for data preparation, analysis, or even programming different study components, your study protocols, as well as your stimuli, basically anything that you would need for someone to replicate your study exactly how you did it. So when I talk about open data and open materials in this presentation, just know that a lot of the things I'm talking about can apply to both of these practices. And a lot of times when I say open data, I kind of also mean open materials as well. So sharing data exists on a spectrum. So I think a lot of people sometimes get a little bit scared about the idea of sharing data because they think it's kind of like a all or nothing thing. But there is a bit of a spectrum of how you can share data. So I'll start kind of with the obvious, on the very far side of the spectrum, you have a functionally closed data set. So this data is not open, it's not available to others. Moving a little further, we have the case where someone might say data available upon request or upon reasonable request. You may see this statement maybe like in a paper or at the end of a manuscript or something like that. This we put a little bit further ahead of closed data set because this is basically requiring your readers of your article to contact you, the study authors, to access data. A more middle ground approach may be restricted access. So this is when you have data or any other study materials that are available to verified researchers. This is usually done through data repository platforms that require users to verify like maybe their institutional affiliation or something like that, and agree to their user agreements before they can access any data available on that repository. There's moving a bit to the more open data spectrum. You can also freely share maybe a part of your data set, but not the whole thing. So perhaps you share your data, except you remove all sensitive information from the data set before sharing, or maybe only a cleaned version of the data is shared. And then on the other far spectrum is freely sharing your full data set. So full unrestricted access to all raw study data from the study and the study materials. So when you think about sharing data, it's also important to talk about how it is formatted and like guidelines for sharing data, which exists, the FAIR principles. So FAIR is an acronym. So F in FAIR stands for findable. So your data materials are assigned a globally unique identifier, are adequately described in your metadata, and are registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So essentially, your data can be assigned a DOI number, especially if you're sharing through platforms like the Open Science Framework, and that DOI number links back to your data set. The A in FAIR stands for accessible, which basically means the data and materials are retrievable by their identifier and are also open, free, and universally implementable. So I like to just think of this as you not only have a link to the data or the ID number, but when you click on that, the data is there and ready to be downloaded. The I stands for interoperable, and this means that your data and materials should be shared in a format that is accessible. So an example that I like to use here is instead of sharing your data in an Excel file, for example, you should strive to share your data in a format like CSV file or a text file, because multiple programs can read CSV or text files, but not all programs can read Excel files, for example. Unless the only exception to this is unless in your particular field, if there's like a kind of uniform format for data. I know this exists like with neuroimaging data. You should follow whatever is the norm in your field. And then the R stands for reusable. So your data and materials are shared with clear usage guidelines and are properly formatted for reuse. So clear usage guidelines refers to usually licensing, which specifies what people can and cannot do with your data, and formatted for reuse kind of links to interoperable, but also goes an extra step, which might have metadata included to help users know what's included in the data and what the different variables are. Oops. Oh, sorry. So when planning for sharing your study data and materials, a lot of people think about, oh, that's something you do at the end, but really it's something that can happen and should be planned for throughout the research cycle. So I have the little graphic here that shows the research cycle, right? We first, of course, always identify our research topic and questions. But the next step is usually designing our research study. You can plan for sharing your data and materials at this stage by creating a workflow and solidifying your consent procedures. In the data collection stage, of course, you're obtaining informed consent from your participants. So this informed consent also usually details what they should be doing, what the data is going to be used for. And then during data collection, keeping your files and materials organized. In data analysis stage, you should be documenting your data cleaning and analysis procedures. You can prepare your data or materials for sharing and update project pages and files that you have perhaps on the open science platform. And then at the dissemination, that's when you finally make your project page on OSF Public, or you upload your data to a repository if you're choosing a more restricted option. So now I'm going to turn it over to James, who's going to talk a little bit more about the barriers and their solutions. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. So yeah, let's talk about barriers, concerns, and kind of how we can address these to hopefully make sharing data more accessible and easier for you. So here we have a couple listed. Confidentiality concerns are, of course, at the forefront of everyone's mind, making sure that we maintain the confidentiality of our participants. There are also potential IRB or institutional barriers, making sure that we can get through those and make sure that everything is as it should be, and from a consenting and IRB perspective. There's also a lot of concern around scooping or wanting to make sure that you can use the data set for continued analyses. A lot of researchers report a lack of time and resources to share their data, and are also worried about the perception or judgment from others, because obviously sharing data kind of makes you vulnerable and that others can interrogate and also use your data. All right, next slide. So one concern surrounding kind of confidentiality concerns is to de-identify your data. And I think most of us probably already do this in our practice, which is probably pretty standard. So taking the participant's name and then turning it into a blinded like ID, for example, or taking the birth date and just making it age. So with the table on the right, we wouldn't be able to identify the participant, whereas on the left, that information is highly identifiable. So de-identifying your data is certainly kind of the first step. All right, next slide. So if de-identification is not possible, so for example, like audio or video data, or even other types of sensitive data, there are a couple of different options that you can take. So the first is to actually obtain explicit consent from the beginning from your participants to share that data, or use some restricted access options for potentially sensitive data. So that's kind of the first option. Secondly, you could also just omit those types of data, so not share them, or share data that's extracted from the original source. So if you have kind of speech files, speech acoustic files, you could just share the de-identified analysis data and not necessarily the raw data. So like Micah was saying before, there certainly exists on this continuum. And then option 3 is synthetic data, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So synthetic data it's actually been around for a couple of decades now. It's widely used across like medical, industry, and government agencies like the Census Bureau. But essentially, it's a way to create an artificial data set that doesn't represent real individuals from your study, but also maintains the statistical properties of your original data. And it works better in some cases versus others. It kind of just depends on your use case and your specific data, but it's very easy. There's an R package called SynthPop that's very user-friendly. And essentially, that's what we have here on the right. We have 2 different outcomes. And the dark blue is the synthetic data, and the light blue is the original data set that was collected. And so as you can see, it mimics and kind of maintains the statistical properties, or at least the distribution in this case, between the original and the synthetic data. It's not perfect, but depending on your use case, it could be a good option if the data is, highly identifiable, and yet you still want to share it and make sure that there's really no way they could trace it back to the original participants. All right, next slide. All right, so concerns about scooping, like I said, a lot of people have concerns about this, and I totally understand it. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that when you share data, you decide when you want to publicly share your study data and materials. So from my experience sharing data, my workflow is that when I'm going to submit a study, a manuscript at a journal, I will have an open science framework page where the data is shared, but I will make sure that it's private so the public can't see it. No one can find it on the internet. And then I create a private link just for the peer reviewers. And so only the peer reviewers in the journal have access to that link. So they can then look at my data, interrogate it for the purposes of peer review. Then, if it's fortunate enough to be accepted, I make it public, and that public link is what is put in the actual manuscript that's given to the readers. But you also can place an embargo. So you can say, I maybe will share it with the peer reviewers, but I won't share it with the public for 3 years or a year, because there are additional analyses that I want to do with it. So there's a lot of flexibility in what you can do. You also should certainly specify a license and DOI to your study data and materials. So that's very easy on Open Science Framework. You can just, they have different kind of templates for different licenses, and the DOI makes your data itself citable. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. Oh, maybe we can erase someone's drawing on the screen by accident. Maybe we can erase that. Okay, so talking about licensing, you can, like I said, apply a Creative Commons license. We have some on the right here that kind of go from more open to less open. There's a lot of flexibility around that. And so there's templates you can use. It's very easy. It's just about picking the one that is right for you. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So Micah briefly touched on, oh, we have someone with their audio on. Okay, so we talked about this data available upon reasonable request, right? This is very common in our fields. I think it's almost like become this de facto thing that we all put. And yet we know from research that less than half of studies provide the requested data when you actually reach out to them. So this really doesn't, in our opinion, doesn't promote researchers properly organizing their data. And so it's really not accessible when someone goes to reach out and ask for it. And that's probably, in my opinion, why they're not providing that data when you reach out, even though the manuscript says that it's available if you were to ask. And we also feel that purposely vague data availability statements may exacerbate inequities, like Micah talked about, and really limit access to others who have fewer resources and opportunities. And so we feel that this statement is almost purposely vague in some cases, and really is a barrier to a cumulative and transparent scientific literature. And it may actually be better to just say that the data is not open, and that's okay. Or it is open, but it's open on a continuum. So it's just the de-identified data, or it's the full data set. So that's data available upon request. All right, so Micah also mentioned that you certainly want to add language about data sharing in your consent. And when it comes to data sharing, I really feel like if you can get ahead of it and incorporate it at the beginning of your research process, that it's just so much smoother. And so if you can include language in your consent and talk to your participants about the importance of sharing the data and what that means, at least in my experience, I've never had someone say, I don't want my data shared. And in my case, I'm usually sharing de-identified data that there's no way that it could be traced back to that person. But just having that conversation and then sharing the data for people that actually consent to it. So this is some example language that I personally use when I'm describing it to participants. And then also you want to make sure that you're including language to describe it to the IRB. And so this is, again, language that I've used in the past. I make sure that I describe the repository that I'm going to use. So I personally use the Open Science Framework. I have in the past gone to our IT team at Teachers College and said, hey, I want to use this repository. Can you vet it and make sure that it meets our standards for data security, and kind of work with me to make sure that this is in the best interest of our participants? And so that's what they did, which was great. And they kind of describe here why and how it meets those standards. And then I kind of go on to say that I'm only going to upload de-identified data that does not contain sensitive or identifying information about participants. I provide an example, and even specify what data I won't share. So I won't share videos or data that's identifiable. All right, next slide. Perfect. So personally, we feel like sharing data is straightforward. It can certainly be daunting, but if you put in the time and effort in the beginning to determine what type and how you're going to share the data, that can make it easier. Also getting IRB approval and including that during your consent to be fully transparent to the participants, and ensuring really that the sharing data is done responsibly and protects your participants' confidentiality. That is should be the forefront of all of our minds. But really, de-identified data is a minimum requirement for ensuring reproducibility and promoting a cumulative science. I think we spend so much time in peer review fixating on the words that we use and less so on the data, which when you think about it is the fundamental aspect of the studies and the conclusions that we make. And so in a world where we have de-identified data that accompanies a manuscript and it becomes computationally reproducible, I think that's, in my opinion, going to promote a cumulative and better science for us. So this is not a small task. We totally understand. And I think there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of make progress in our fields moving forward. So first, larger systemic changes at the organizational level are important through ASHA, our individual kind of subfield societies. And certainly ASHA has done a great job prioritizing this with their special issue and badges, which certainly are important. And then also dedicated coursework for doctoral students on open science and data sharing and really training the next generation of researchers. Also a mindset shift at the institutional level related to kind of incentive structures for, say, tenure review. So rewarding researchers for studies that are both rigorous and also highly transparent. And so really hoping that we can promote a broader cultural shift in the field towards a more collaborative and pro-social view of our science. All right, and then the last thing we want to talk about, which I know can be an uncomfortable topic for many, but as scientists, we really feel that we have an obligation to have these types of conversations, especially now. So one thing that we have noticed at CSDisseminate is that the current administration is really using this technique that is really weaponizing principles of open science to push an anti-science agenda with really the goal of undermining research, so say in climate change or related to vaccine efficacy, to try to inject political agendas into evidence-based policy. So essentially using good faith principles like reproducibility and transparency to attack kind of established evidence-based research and policy. And so the way you could think of someone weaponizing this is by saying, for example, that, well, a study on vaccine efficacy was not fully reproducible, or it wasn't transparent, or they didn't share their data. So according to open science, we can't trust the study's findings. But we really want to emphasize that a study that is not fully transparent or reproducible doesn't mean that it's fundamentally flawed, right? We can't use open science as a signal that indicates quality. It only indicates whether a study has taken the steps to be transparent. And so irreproducibility and not adhering to open science practices doesn't mean that the study is flawed. That's kind of the takeaway. So really, we're hoping that as both scientists and consumers of research, we can be aware of this and also actively resist. And as a field, we certainly can do better and be more transparent, but also recognize that not engaging in open science doesn't mean that a study is fundamentally flawed. So I think we want to just recognize the nuance, because it's not a binary kind of this or that thing. It's something that we can do to make our science better, but doesn't mean that previous research or research that elects to not do this is inherently flawed. So just wanted to recognize that. And so, yeah, we have a QR code for some references and some resources, and we want to take the rest of the time to answer any questions or engage in the dialogue. But thank you so much.
Yeah,
And
so I'm gonna keep this up a little bit longer, but then I'll take it down. But any questions? And you can feel free to even unmute yourself and just speak it out, because definitely in presenter mode, I don't see everyone's chats easily.
Hi, this is Jessica Huber. Thanks for this is really helpful. I'm trying to figure this all out. And I'm trying to load your link, but are the things that you put in your consent form or in your IRB, did you share those up there, James?
I don't know if they're there, but we will make the slides available and the
Okay.
recording as well. And I'm happy to share more, and I can put that out in there, definitely. Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you share how you've handled data? So like my universities have always required these data agreements, like a contract for me to send my data somewhere. And how do you get around, like, how are you getting around that to be able to have it up?
Yeah, so my impression, at least engaging again with the Teachers College, which I totally recognize that every place is going to be different and have different regulations. But I feel like if you consent the participant to begin with, you have more autonomy to share the data as you stipulated to the participant. So I feel like if you're getting ahead of it, it would be easier, but I also haven't engaged in a data use agreement. So it could be unique. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this has been the biggest barrier, like stupid, like I just want to send like the file from like what I did the stats on. Basically, there's nothing in there. It's just
Yeah.
data and subject codes. There's very little, and I can't even like send that file without one of these contracts. So I don't know if anyone else has gotten around that. I would love to know the way around. And you ask another question?
Yeah, of course.
So how do you, as James knows, I need to get my codes out. These codes I use that people keep asking for. Do you put those on OSF? Is that a good place to put codes, or do you use like some other platform for codes?
I like it. Micah, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Are you talking about codes as in like your analysis scripts, things like that?
Yeah, they're just MATLAB scripts. They're
Oh,
not any like secret sauce, but people ask for them. So
yeah. So what I personally do, I use R, but same difference, right? I will post I usually have a GitHub account linked with my OSF page. So on GitHub, my code and even my data lives technically on the GitHub, but then on OSF, I link that GitHub project to the OSF project. So it will basically show on OSF as well. So, because the one thing I just would like to do is in my workflow when I'm coding, I just make commits and push to GitHub as my version control because sometimes I work on multiple different computers. So instead of needing to remember, oh, I need to upload the new version of the script every time, that kind of takes care of that. I do feel though GitHub's a different topic and beast to talk about a different day, but if you're interested, you can look into that. Okay, and then I do see that someone has their hand up, Aaron Johnson.
Hi, thanks so much for trying to push this initiative forward. I philosophically agree wholeheartedly. Some of the barriers you've identified are big ones for me in terms of time and money, and I just wanted to second what Jessica was saying about institutional barriers and data sharing. There's a new data sharing board that I need to submit, this huge form to anytime I want to send anything out to any collaborators, and it's really become quite difficult. I know with federal funding that we're required to, put a data sharing plan in place, and so there's that exists. But I think in terms of thinking about some of those institutional barriers and around commercialization, that's another big thing that my institution is really watchful of, is that's one of the major concerns of sharing data is this data that could be used in any sort of commercialization attempt. So just as you're continuing to push this initiative forward, I'd encourage you to consider those additional barriers and help us try to overcome them, because I, again, philosophically really would like to be on board with this and do what I can to share data.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wanted to go back to this slide with the Creative Commons licensing, because at least you're concerned for commercialization. There are some of these license types that specifically say the data cannot be used for commercialization purposes. So, can use non-commercially. So I did want to at least point that out for that concern. But yes, this is fairly new for our field, so I'm sure we're going to always encounter different unique barriers to that as well.
Looks like we have a question in the chat, unless someone else the question. So the question is, how does open science work for grants? Let's say you have a big data set that you later decide to make a public repository for people to use for different analyses. I want to ask if you have any experience with how to mention it on grants, or do you have any experience with data dissemination grants in particular, or is that completely different than open science? Yeah, that's a great question. I know that there's been, I'm blanking on the person, but there's the repository for Aphasia Bank, for example. So that's a NIH funded repository for actual raw stimuli. So I think that's just a different beast altogether. But yeah, I would say that, again, a lot of this just depends on your use case. And what you're trying to accomplish. I think sharing de-identified data is hopefully a little easier than sharing the raw speech files, for example. Mike, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think you covered it well. Yeah.
Perfect. Other questions or topics of conversation?
I can go ahead if no one has a question. Thanks, Micah and James. So I'm planning on sharing my dissertation data too. And I was thinking now, listening to you guys, I had two thoughts of our questions. So the first one, when choosing which data repository to share on, do you think there are pros or cons? I was thinking of TalkBank. It's commonly used for language research, but I know kind of the format of OSF is just cleaner and just easier to navigate. So that's one thing. And would it make sense to have a project home for it on OSF as well, and then have the transcripts themselves be on TalkBank? So that was my first question, and then maybe I can ask the next after.
Yeah, I think it depends, again, on your use case. There's so many different repositories to choose from. When I was looking at OSF, what I liked about it was they have guaranteed funding to ensure that your data will be findable for 50 to 75 years, which by then it'll be a whole different conversation. So yeah, I think it also depends on, do you have IRB approval to share those transcripts? Because maybe if it's sensitive data and you don't have that, OSF probably isn't best, because that's more of a public kind of access. So to me, OSF is really de-identified data. I'm comfortable with everyone seeing it. I'm comfortable with anyone getting access to anything I put on there. If it's more restricted, there are probably better other ones. I know some institutions even have their own repository, and then you can kind of request access from that. So not really an answer, but
Yeah. And then I think I mean, I don't know the intricacies of your own data, but if you have to consider something like TalkBank for, maybe potentially sensitive reasons, I think there's a hybrid approach where you could have maybe the sensitive data live on TalkBank, but then maybe have a de-identified, analysis-friendly version on OSF. Or maybe all your data just lives on TalkBank, and then you use the OSF page for supporting materials, and you just on the project page, provide a link to TalkBank where you can request access. I think there's a happy medium with that.
That's what I was thinking. Because the transcripts themselves probably fit TalkBank, but then having the documents could be cleaner on OSF. So I like this hybrid approach. Another question that I had was regarding language that we could use. I've had a mentor kind of recommend that if I'm interested in co-authoring on certain projects, if someone wants to use that data, have you seen examples of language like that, or not really? Kind of specifying, like, if you were to do this, I'd be interested in being like a collaborator on this project. But if you were to use it, let's say for phonology, like you can take it or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if the licenses that are just boilerplate would have that. But I mean, I'm also of the opinion that if for someone were to come and, try to use a data set, it's probably best to reach out to the original author and just say, I'm going to use it. And is there potential for collaboration? I think it's easier to think, oh, I'm just going to use this, but who knows the data best, if not the person who uploaded it and did the study. So I've certainly seen collaborations that have been really fruitful. I know Elaine Kearney has had a few, but again, yeah, I don't know anything official. Maybe others have thoughts.
Yeah, same. I don't know anything official either. Like those licenses are pretty broad. Though it might just be general etiquette. Like if you were interested in the data, just be like, even to send like a thank you for sharing kind of email. And yeah, but I don't know anything official.
Yeah, I think that is the one drawback. When you put your data and you make it freely available, it is out there and it's available. And I think it's being comfortable with that. And also, maybe you want to put an embargo for a few years, as an early career researcher who doesn't have a lot of data in their back pocket, and maybe wants to use it or could see potential for other publications. It's kind of a pro and a con.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think another thing I grapple with when people talk about scooping is, you think there's a lot more reuses of your data than there actually is. And I think it also is it's a way for you to say, okay, how can I use this data in the best way possible in the current manuscript that I'm publishing, right? And a lot of times, if you're only sharing the analysis data, how many other ways are there to reanalyze it? And I think it's probably less of a concern than we get nervous about, but I totally understand the concern.
Yeah. And I also think people come to questions, even if two people are addressing a very similar research question, most likely those two people are probably approaching it slightly differently and have different thoughts. So I think, it kind of helps with reproducibility, but I do understand the concerns as well.
A quick question about that. I'm not really worried about being scooped. I'd be tickled if anyone were interested in anything I was studying, but I I do wonder about citations. I know that mechanisms are in place to cite data sets. I'm just wondering, in your experience, have you seen that work? Are people appropriately citing the open data sort sets that they're using within CSD in particular?
Yeah, I think that you're going to get a citation on the study for sure, right? Then it's a question of, are they going to cite the DOI that's unique to the data? So to me, the citation for the study is enough. I mean, I've seen that before, but I understand if you want the data set itself to be a citable thing. But also, it depends what the data set is. Is the data set all of your data from a grant? Then that is like a very meaningful and should be cited as its own thing. Or is it just the de-identified data to reproduce a study that you've published? In which case, I personally am of the opinion that a citation for the manuscript is sufficient. And I think there's been some research that shows that that's the case. You get more citations if you share your data for the manuscript that it's accompanying.
Yeah, I agree. To my knowledge, only know of one instance someone using my data, but it wasn't for a research purpose. It was for a class purpose. But yeah, I believe they kind of just linked back to my original study, not necessarily the OSF DOI number. And I'm personally okay with that. But I think James brings up a point, like if you're sharing like a data set from a whole big grand study, then that's probably something worthy of it being cited from its own thing, because presumably you have a lot more in there.
Or perhaps that warrants a publication, right? Like that the data set itself is if it's that meaningful of a resource to the field, then I feel like that could be one way to ensure that it gets cited. But yeah, I totally understand your concern. Oh yeah, Austin just shared something in the chat about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Austin.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I would say like my general recommendation is to start small. Try to just share the de-identified data with the publication. And for something that you're starting the study at the beginning of the workflow, and you can go through the IRB and the consenting. And so you feel like everything is done correctly, you feel comfortable with what you're sharing, the participants are aware. And then it's also not a huge risk to you because you're already publishing on it. And if it's, maybe a couple variables from the data set, but it's reproducible and someone could extend that and use it for a meta-analysis, for example, that feels like a really great entry point for a lot of people. And that's how I personally got involved doing it. Perfect. Well, yeah, there's lots of great resources in the chat. And yeah, feel free to email Micah or myself. And we will certainly be posting the recording and the slides and resources through the CSDisseminate social media channels. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and it's really exciting to see so many people that are excited about sharing data.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.